January 1985, Langley, Virginia. The man who would inflict the deepest wound in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency parked his gray sedan outside headquarters, walked through security at the main entrance, and sat down at his desk in the Soviet East Europe Division, just as he had done for years. There was nothing remarkable about him. He was not a charismatic field operative. He was not a legend in the clandestine service. He was an analyst and later a counterintelligence officer, middle rank, with a reputation for being competent but unexceptional. To his colleagues, he was the kind of man who fades into the institutional wallpaper of a government bureaucracy. No one imagined that a man this ordinary was about to compromise the CIA's deepest assets inside the Soviet Union. He was not driven by ideology. He did not believe Marxism was the future. He did not believe communism was a moral calling. He believed in something far simpler. He believed in personal financial survival and in personal entitlement. The Soviet Union was not expecting what he was about to offer them. The KGB had recruited valuable sources before, but never one with his specific access and his specific level of compartmented visibility into CIA operations targeting the USSR. In the winter of 1985, he walked into a discreet meeting in Washington with a KGB handler and handed over the first dossier of CIA secrets. The Soviets paid him $50,000 in cash. Few realized its importance at the time, but that payment marked the beginning of the single most destructive penetration of the CIA during the entire Cold War. The KGB had obtained a window directly into CIA operations. Within months, Soviet counterintelligence officers in Moscow began arresting, interrogating, and executing CIA assets. CIA case officers in the field watched sources go silent. Reports stopped coming. Networks broke apart. Inside Langley, officers debated endlessly what was happening. The immediate assumption was that the KGB had advanced their internal vetting system or had broken certain tradecraft patterns. It never occurred to them early on that the true explanation was simpler and far more devastating. There was a mole inside their own headquarters who was handing Moscow Center the true names of CIA assets. This man knew exactly which Soviet officials had been recruited by the United States. He had reviewed their files. He had access to their reporting. He understood their code names, and he had full knowledge of the compartmented human structure that protected clandestine sources. The magnitude of this betrayal cannot be overstated. In the Cold War, human sources inside the Soviet Union represented the single most valuable intelligence commodity the United States possessed. Soviet military commanders, Soviet intelligence officers, and Soviet industrial officials who secretly reported to the CIA provided the United States with a view of the Soviet system that no satellite, no intercepted cable, and no radar system could replicate. And within months of this man beginning his espionage, those networks began to disintegrate. CIA officers in Moscow reported that Soviet surveillance teams were suddenly more precise, more aggressive, and more informed. Meetings that would have been possible in 1982 were impossible in 1986. Brush passes became suicidal. Dead drops became traps, and CIA operations officers did not understand why. They continued to blame Soviet counterintelligence reforms. They continued to attribute failures to improved surveillance. But the true explanation was sitting at a desk in Langley, drinking government coffee, reviewing operations, and quietly planning his next meeting with the KGB. He destroyed the CIA's ability to recruit in Moscow for nearly a decade, not through brilliant spycraft, but through simple disclosure. When his betrayals began to alter the course of CIA operations, no one connected the dots. After all, he was not an ideal candidate for suspicion. He had a long CIA pedigree. His father had been a CIA officer. He had spent his entire adult life inside the institution. He had grown up in the culture of American intelligence. That heritage helped immunize him against suspicion. CIA leadership believed that legacy officers were the most reliable defenders of American national security. In reality, legacy officers often possessed a certain institutional arrogance. They believed they were beyond suspicion simply because of who they were. And this man used that cultural blind spot ruthlessly. He knew how CIA investigators thought. He knew the standard investigative templates used to detect moles, and he carefully constructed his life in a way that evaded those detection patterns. His name was Aldrich Ames. Inside the CIA, he was known simply as Rick. He had joined the agency in 1962, straight out of college, and spent 2 decades rising slowly through the ranks. He was not brilliant. He was not incompetent. He was the median of the CIA's human material, the kind of man that institutions overlook because they appear harmless. He drank too much. He was financially irresponsible. He was insecure. He was resentful, and those resentments metastasized into betrayal. By the late 1970s, Ames's career was stalled. He had been sent to New York to work at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. His performance was mediocre but not catastrophic. His supervisors considered him salvageable. The CIA is very forgiving to legacy officers. His father had been CIA. Rick was one of theirs. He was protected by institutional bias. But while in New York, he committed his first minor compromat act. He had an affair with a foreign national, a Colombian woman. This was a violation of CIA security rules, but once again, institutional bias shielded him. He was reprimanded, the case was handled, and the lesson he learned was not that he was at risk. The lesson he learned was that he could break the rules and nothing would happen. His career should have been terminated then. Instead, he was reassigned. From 1981 to 1983, Ames served in Mexico City. He worked Soviet operations. He officially divorced his American wife and married the Colombian woman. His financial situation deteriorated. He lived beyond his means. He began borrowing money. He was in constant personal debt. In a normal counterintelligence culture, these indicators would have triggered deep review. In the CIA of the 1980s, they triggered nothing. The institutional assumption was that CIA officers, particularly those with lineage, were loyal by default. Internal security was token, polygraphs were infrequent, financial monitoring was minimal. The agency's pride in being a family created the exact vulnerability Moscow needed. In April 1985, Aldrich Ames made his approach to the Soviet embassy in Washington. He walked into the diplomatic mission of America's greatest adversary and volunteered to spy. This moment is the most important moment of the betrayal because it was entirely self-initiated. He was not recruited. He was not manipulated. He was not blackmailed. He simply walked in and offered secrets. It was the KGB's dream scenario. He produced classified CIA files, giving Moscow the names of CIA's most valuable Soviet sources. In exchange, the Soviets handed him $50,000 on the spot. This first payment was not random. It was a calculated test. If the CIA monitored his finances, this sudden influx would trigger red flags. The KGB believed the CIA would detect this. They were wrong. Ames purchased a Jaguar. He paid debts. He lived more comfortably. CIA colleagues simply assumed that his new wife, a foreign national, had personal wealth. Others assumed he had received a modest inheritance. No one suspected espionage. After that first transaction, a pattern formed. Ames would contact the KGB via dead-drop signals and meet handlers in secure environments. He would hand over CIA cable traffic, asset reports, and lists of HUMINT penetrations. The KGB would pay in cash, structured to avoid immediate detection. They used banks in Switzerland. They used transactions routed through third-party cutouts. Ames's wealth increased gradually, but consistently. By 1986, CIA case officers inside Moscow began to understand something was catastrophically wrong. Between 1985 and 1986, virtually every CIA human penetration of the Soviet system was neutralized. Some were arrested, some disappeared permanently. The agency did not yet understand that the Soviets were operating with privileged intelligence. CIA leadership suspected an internal breach, but did not want to believe it. It was psychologically easier to blame improved Soviet tradecraft. In late 1986, the CIA lost one of its most valuable Soviet military sources. This was an individual who had access to Soviet strategic assessments. His arrest sent shockwaves through the small number of Americans who understood the stakes. Still, Ames continued working inside CIA headquarters. He now held a position in counterintelligence. He was assigned to the very section tasked with evaluating KGB penetrations of the CIA. In other words, the mole was now put in charge of hunting himself. Ames fed the KGB priceless information, and at the same time misdirected CIA investigators away from himself. He introduced false leads. He suggested explanations for asset losses that had nothing to do with an internal mole. He framed innocuous Soviet countermeasures as strategic evolutions. The KGB could not have invented a better outcome. The penetration was not only successful, it was now fortified. In 1987, Ames purchased a $540,000 house in Arlington, Virginia, paying cash. In 1988, the first genuine suspicion that an internal mole existed within the CIA began to surface more aggressively. Case officers who had worked the Moscow target for 15 years quietly told their superiors that the pattern of asset losses could not be explained by improved KGB surveillance alone. The arrests were too precise. The timing was too synchronized, and the Soviets were focusing not on low-level sources, but on highly compartmented penetrations that even many inside the CIA's Soviet division did not know existed. This type of damage could not come from outside intercepts. It could not come from a KGB walk-in. It could not even come from a single compromised CIA case officer in the field. The losses demonstrated an insider with access to the CIA's most sensitive and restricted compartments. The CIA convened an internal working group to quietly examine these losses. Ironically and tragically, Aldrich Ames was part of the personnel pool that reviewed these questions. He sat in meetings about unexplained Soviet arrests that he had personally caused. He reviewed cables discussing the collapse of American networks that he himself had delivered to Moscow. He offered analysis and speculation about how the KGB might have developed new counterintelligence methods. His participation allowed him to shape the emerging narrative and to direct attention away from himself. Throughout 1988 and 1989, CIA leadership offered multiple theories to explain Soviet performance: improved surveillance, new encryption systems, enhanced discipline within the KGB's counterintelligence directorate. None of these were correct. All of them were tolerated because the idea of a traitor at headquarters was psychologically difficult to accept. This phenomenon, the institutional inability to accept internal betrayal, is common in intelligence services worldwide. Security officers prefer to believe that the enemy is cunning, not that colleagues are treasonous. The CIA's culture, which prized trust among officers, made the idea of a traitor almost unthinkable. Meanwhile, Ames continued to receive payments. By 1989, he had received more than $1 million from the KGB. The Soviets did not pay him sporadically, they paid him systematically. They saw him not as a temporary asset, but as a strategic penetration. His intelligence was not tactical. His intelligence allowed the KGB to map CIA operations against the Soviet Union at the systemic level. By 1990, the CIA's infiltration of the Soviet system was crippled. For decades after the Cold War, scholars would debate the cause of the United States human intelligence failure in the late 1980s. Many would point to the cultural collapse of the Soviet Union itself and argue that HUMINT had simply become more difficult. But those who examined the classified record understood the truth. HUMINT died because the Soviets killed it, and they killed it because Aldrich Ames gave them the names. By 1991, Aldrich Ames was promoted, despite multiple performance issues, despite a documented history of poor management, despite drinking problems. He rose in rank, and with every promotion came deeper access. He rotated into positions that handled interagency liaison, including coordination between CIA and FBI on Soviet penetrations. He was now overseeing the very interface between the United States' two principal counterintelligence organizations while working for Moscow. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some at Langley believed that the end of the Cold War would resolve many unexplained losses. Perhaps the KGB had been executing a last surge of roll-ups before their own dissolution. But this logic was incorrect. Even after the USSR dissolved, the SVR, the KGB's foreign intelligence successor, continued to handle Ames. They continued to pay him. The Russian Federation inherited both the KGB's archives and its spy. In 1992, the CIA experienced an internal shift. A new generation of counterintelligence investigators, many shaped by the late Cold War failures, began to ask a different question. Not, why did the Soviets get better, but who in our system could have given them the information they clearly possessed? A quiet investigative cell was formed. Its mandate was narrow: identify a mole. This cell did not assume that the CIA was invulnerable. It assumed the opposite, that the CIA had been penetrated. Their approach was more systematic. They began by analyzing unexplained wealth. They examined who inside Soviet division had access to certain classification compartments. They examined lifestyle inflation. For the first time, Aldrich Ames appeared in the data. Not because of rumors, not because of gossip, but because the financial data, when cross-referenced with his nominal salary, revealed a discrepancy that statistical probability could not explain. Ames had received unexplained funds that could not be accounted for by any legal means. Still, even at this point, the CIA was hesitant to accuse him. The institutional psychology of the agency resisted the idea. To accuse a legacy officer of espionage required a level of certainty that went beyond suspicion. It required proof, and proof would require time. By early 1993, the CIA and FBI had formed a joint task group dedicated exclusively to building a case against the mole. Aldrich Ames continued to come to work. He continued to handle sensitive information. He continued to meet with Russians, and he did not know that the noose was slowly closing around him. In mid-1993, the investigative focus finally narrowed. The joint CIA-FBI mole-hunting task force ran an internal bank records subpoena. They obtained Ames's financial statements. What they saw ended all doubt. Between 1985 and 1993, Ames had deposited and spent well over $2 million in cash and assets, while earning a government salary of roughly $60,000 a year. He had purchased expensive real estate in Arlington. He had paid cash for luxury vehicles. He had traveled internationally without hesitation, without budgeting, without concern. The pattern was mathematically impossible for a CIA officer of his grade. The task force now shifted from suspicion to containment. They began intrusive surveillance. They intercepted Ames's phone lines, collected trash, followed his movements, planted tail cars on his daily commute, and monitored his communications. For the first time since 1985, the US government began actively observing the man who had been destroying their human intelligence architecture for nearly a decade. By autumn 1993, the investigators built a timeline linking Ames's foreign meetings with specific Soviet roll-ups. They matched his declared travel against known KGB/SVR schedules. They identified dead drop signals he had used. They found coded messages transmitted via newspapers. Every pattern confirmed that Ames had been delivering information directly to the KGB. The final evidence came not from surveillance, but from forensic accounting. The FBI's financial analysts traced the source of Ames's funds to covert accounts held by the KGB and routed through foreign intermediaries. This financial signature was the irreversible proof the government needed. Once the financial linkage was complete, the United States government authorized arrest. But the arrest had to be timed for maximum isolation to prevent Ames from destroying evidence or fleeing. On February 21, 1994, as he drove from his home in Arlington to CIA headquarters, the FBI executed the takedown. They boxed in his Jaguar sedan, forced him to the curb, and arrested him. Inside his briefcase was sensitive CIA documentation that he had prepared to deliver to the Russians. Aldrich Ames was transported to a secure facility for interrogation. During processing, he showed minimal emotion. When confronted with the evidence, he did not deny it. He asked what deal could be made. There was no deal. The damage was done. The consequences were irreversible. In his formal plea, Ames admitted to knowingly providing the KGB and later the SVR with the identities of virtually every CIA asset working against the Soviet Union from 1985 onward. He acknowledged that his betrayal directly resulted in arrests, imprisonments, and executions. U.S. intelligence officers later estimated that his espionage caused the deaths of at least 10 American assets inside the USSR. Some experts believe the true number may be higher. Aldrich Ames received a life sentence without parole. He was placed in federal custody. His wife was convicted as an accessory after the fact and received a 5-year sentence. The damage assessment, however, would last much longer. For years after Ames's arrest, CIA internal reviews attempted to quantify the true strategic cost. The consensus within classified circles was that the United States lost its deepest sources into the Soviet strategic apparatus at the precise moment that the Soviet Union was entering its final period of ideological and structural instability. The CIA entered the 1990s, a decade of global reorientation, partially blind. Ames's betrayal did not simply disrupt operations during the last phase of the Cold War. It permanently altered U.S. intelligence capacity at a pivotal historical inflection point. The United States lost trust with foreign intelligence services who had shared risk and sources with CIA. Potential Soviet recruits who might have been willing to spy for America lost faith that the CIA could protect them. Recruitment in Moscow would never again be conducted under the same assumptions of safety. The CIA responded by attempting to rebuild its internal security processes. Polygraphs became more frequent, financial monitoring was strengthened, counterintelligence was institutionalized as a permanent priority. But none of these reforms changed the historical reality. The CIA had been penetrated at its core because it had believed itself immune. The Ames case remains a defining event in American intelligence history. Scholars of espionage analysis cite Ames as a case study of institutional blindness. He was not a brilliant double agent. He was not ideological. He was not elusive. He simply identified the seams in the CIA's internal controls and exploited them, and he succeeded because the CIA, like many powerful organizations, assumed that the greatest threat was external. It never imagined that the most devastating threat would sit quietly at a desk inside its own building. Ames taught U.S. intelligence a lesson that cannot be forgotten. The danger is not only in what the enemy knows, the danger is in what the institution refuses to see. His betrayal proved that the most destructive enemy does not have to breach a border, intercept a cable, or break a cipher. The most destructive enemy is the insider with access and no loyalty. Aldrich Ames sits today in a federal prison, serving a life sentence. He is an old man now. The Cold War is over. The world he operated in, a world defined by ideological competition between East and West, by proxy conflicts and nuclear brinkmanship, has passed into history. But the consequences of what he did have never gone away. Inside the CIA, the damage is discussed quietly, in closed rooms, by people who understand the true scale. When senior officers brief young counterintelligence trainees on the history of American internal penetrations, Ames is not described as a singular aberration. He is described as a structural failure. His case is used not to warn young officers about the KGB. His case is used to warn them about the CIA. Every major intelligence service in the world views the Ames case as a parable. Institutions do not fall because their enemies are brilliant. Institutions fall because they are blind. The Soviet Union no longer exists, but the successor services, the SVR and the FSB, still study Ames in their training academies. He is viewed not just as a useful source, but as a demonstration of how institutional complacency is the most reliable ally a penetration can have. A mole thrives not in the shadows, but in the blind spots of his own service. And this is why Ames matters historically far beyond the Cold War, because the threat that he represented has not gone away. The technological landscape has changed. Intelligence today involves cyber intrusions, digital signals intelligence, data exfiltration, insider threat monitoring, and machine learning detection models. But all of those tools still rely on assumptions about trust. In every age, ancient or modern, espionage succeeds when trust is exploited. The KGB understood this principle in 1985. They understood that the most valuable targets are not foreign case officers operating covertly in Moscow. The most valuable targets are the ones sitting inside the secure walls of their own headquarters, with access to everything. Aldrich Ames proved that one man, strategically positioned, can inflict more damage than 1,000 field agents. He showed that what matters in intelligence is not the dramatic rhetoric of patriotism or ideology. What matters is access and the willingness to sell it. The CIA's post-Ames reforms were substantial, but they were not perfect. Multiple American institutions, from NSA to DIA to FBI, have continued to wrestle with internal penetrations in the decades since. Ames's case taught the United States a painful truth. A nation can build the most sophisticated surveillance systems on Earth. It can deploy satellites, decrypt codes, and intercept encrypted traffic, and still be defeated by a single insider motivated by personal interest. And this leads to the final reflection that intelligence historians make about Ames. He was not a super spy. He was not a genius. He was not a master manipulator. He was a bureaucrat with access and nothing more. The danger he represented came not from exceptional skill, but from the ordinary nature of his position inside the institutional structure. His betrayal demonstrates that intelligence agencies can just as easily be destroyed from within by mediocrity as they can from outside by brilliance. In the end, what Ames compromised was not simply classified files. He compromised the foundational assumption that loyalty is inherent to the institution. History will remember him not because he was extraordinary, but because he exploited the CIA's belief that its own officers would never betray it. And that single assumption, that blindness, cost the United States its human intelligence capability inside the Soviet Union at one of the most critical moments of the 20th century. His story remains a warning. A state can protect itself against foreign armies. It can protect itself against rival nations. It can protect itself against external threats, but no state, no matter how powerful, can ever fully protect itself from the enemy who sits quietly at a desk inside its own headquarters.